In the vibrant chaos of Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, where silks shimmer and secrets whisper, a charming art dealer is found dead, a jewelled dagger at his side. Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster from Willowbrook, steps into a web of greed and betrayal. A nervous young woman hides a stolen amulet, a merchant conceals illicit deals, and a scholar's pride turns deadly. As motives unravel in Lady Beatrice's opulent villa, Miss Marple's keen eye pierces the bazaar's enchantment, exposing a killer among the shadows. Will she untangle the truth before another secret strikes? Dive into a mystery where every glance holds a clue, and murder lurks beneath Istanbul's ancient allure. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Istanbul. In the quiet village of Willowbrook, where the lanes wound lazily past ivy-clad cottages and the church clock ticked with unhurried precision, Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour. The late afternoon sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table, where her knitting lay. A half-finished scarf in soft grey wool. Her hands, deft and sure despite their age, paused as she reached for the letter that had arrived that morning, its foreign postmark bold against the cream envelope. Istanbul, it read, in a flourish of ink that spoke of distant lands and forgotten friendships. The letter was from Lady Beatrice Harrow, a spirited woman Miss Marple had known in her youth, when both were schoolgirls with dreams larger than their provincial lives. Beatrice, now widowed and settled in Istanbul after her husband's diplomatic postings, wrote with infectious enthusiasm. She described the city's minarets piercing the sky, the clamour of its markets, and the grand bazaar, a maze of treasures that seemed to pulse with secrets. "You must come, Jane," she urged, "for our charity gala, where the city's elite will gather under my roof. Bring your sharp wits. They'll find amusement here." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Beatrice, ever the dramatist, knew her friend's knack for noticing what others missed. The decision to travel was not made lightly. Willowbrook, with its predictable rhythms, the grocer's gossip, the vicar's sermons, suited Miss Marple's quiet life. Yet the pull of adventure, subtle but insistent, stirred her. She envisioned the bazaar's stalls, the scent of saffron and rosewater, and Beatrice's grand home, alive with intrigue. By evening, her suitcase was packed with practical dresses and a single hat, chosen for its modesty rather than fashion. The Orient Express awaited, promising a journey into the unknown. The train was a marvel of elegance, its polished wood and velvet seats a stark contrast to Willowbrook's simplicity. Miss Marple, settled in her compartment, observed her fellow passengers with the keen eye of one accustomed to unravelling human nature. A young Englishwoman, Clara Wentworth, sat opposite, her delicate features marred by a nervous twitch. She clutched a velvet reticule, her fingers tracing its embroidery as if seeking comfort. Miss Marple noted the girl's pale complexion, and the way her eyes flicked toward the window, avoiding contact. A troubled soul, she thought, recalling the anxious young women of Willowbrook who hid secrets behind polite smiles. Across the aisle, a Turkish gentleman, Mr. Osman Bey, puffed on a carved pipe, its smoke curling like a question mark. His attire, silk waistcoat, gold watch chain, spoke of wealth, but his furrowed brow suggested burdens beyond commerce. He murmured to a companion in Turkish, his voice low and urgent, and Miss Marple, though unable to understand the words, sensed the weight of his concerns. She made a mental note. A merchant, perhaps, with dealings that extended beyond the marketplace. As the train wound through Europe's changing landscapes, Miss Marple engaged Clara in light conversation. "First time to Istanbul?" she asked, her tone gentle. Clara nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm visiting a friend," she said, but offered no more. Miss Marple did not press. She knew truths emerged in their own time. Instead, she turned her attention to Osman Bey, who had risen to pace the corridor. His glance met hers briefly, sharp and assessing, before he resumed his murmured exchange. By the time the train's whistle announced their arrival in Istanbul, Miss Marple had catalogued these impressions, her mind already weaving patterns from the threads of human behaviour. The city greeted her with a cacophony of sounds. Vendors' cries, the clatter of carts, the distant call to prayer. Beatrice's driver, a courteous man named Mehmet, met her at the station, navigating the bustling streets to a villa perched above the Bosphorus. Its white walls gleamed under the sun, and its gardens bloomed with jasmine. Beatrice welcomed her with a warm embrace, her laughter echoing through the marble hall. "Jane, you haven't changed a bit," she exclaimed, though her eyes lingered on Miss Marple's unassuming figure, as if marvelling at the quiet strength within. Over tea, Beatrice spoke of the gala, a fundraiser for a local orphanage. "You'll meet such characters, Jane," she said, her eyes sparkling. "Clara's here already. She's a nervous thing, isn't she? And there's Osman Bey, a merchant with a nose for rare finds. Oh, and Professor Crane, an archaeologist who's all brains and no manners." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly, her mind filing away names and motives. The stage was set, and though she knew not what drama awaited, her instincts, honed by years in Willowbrook, whispered that Istanbul held more than beauty. It held secrets, waiting to be unravelled. Chapter 2. The Enchanted Bazaar. The morning sun spilled over Istanbul, gilding the domes and minarets that rose above the city's labyrinthine streets. Miss Jane Marple, refreshed after a night in Lady Beatrice, Harrow's elegant villa, stood at the threshold of the Grand Bazaar, her sensible shoes planted firmly on the ancient cobblestones. Beside her, Beatrice radiated enthusiasm, her silk scarf fluttering as she gestured toward the arched entrance. "Jane, you've never seen anything like this," she declared, her voice bright with the pride of an adopted Istanbulu. "It's a world unto itself. Spices, silks, secrets." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a smile, her eyes already scanning the crowd, alert to the undercurrents beneath the market's vibrant chaos. The bazaar was a sensory assault, its vaulted ceilings echoing with the cadence of haggling vendors and the clink of copper trays. Stalls overflowed with treasures, bolts of emerald and sapphire silk, brass lanterns casting filigreed shadows, and trays of saffron that glowed like captured sunlight. The air was thick with the mingled scents of cardamom, rosewater, and leather, and Miss Marple, though outwardly serene, felt a thrill akin to her Willowbrook days, when a whispered rumour at the post office hinted at deeper truths. Here, every glance and gesture seemed laden with meaning, and her sharp mind catalogued each detail. Beatrice led the way, navigating the maze with practised ease, her chatter a guide to the bazaar's wonders. Clara Wentworth trailed behind, her velvet reticule clutched tightly, her eyes darting as if expecting pursuit. Miss Marple noted the young woman's unease, so like the nervous girls of Willowbrook, who hid love letters or family quarrels. "Clara, dear," Beatrice called, pausing at a stall piled with embroidered shawls. "Wouldn't this suit you?" Clara managed a faint smile, but her fingers twisted the reticule's cord, betraying her distraction. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her, sensing a story yet to unfold. At a tea stall, where the vendor poured amber liquid into tulip-shaped glasses, they encountered Mr. Osmond Bay, the merchant from the train. His silk waistcoat gleamed under the bazaar's lamplight, but his eyes were shadowed, his pipe absent today. "Lady Harrow," he greeted, bowing slightly, "and Miss Marple, a pleasure." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple detected a guarded edge, as if he weighed each word. Beatrice introduced him as a dealer in rare manuscripts, his stall a treasure trove for scholars and collectors. Osmond's smile was polite, but his glance toward Clara was sharp, almost accusing. Miss Marple filed this away, recalling how village feuds often hid behind courteous nods. As they sipped tea, another figure approached. Professor Elias Crane, an archaeologist whose tweed jacket seemed out of place amid the bazaar's opulence. His face was weathered, his manner brusque, as if the market's charm irritated him. "Beatrice, you've dragged me into this chaos again," he grumbled, though his eyes scanned the stalls with a predator's focus. Beatrice laughed, undeterred. "Elias, you love it here. Jane, he's studying Ottoman relics, always chasing some dusty artifact." Crane's gaze met Miss Marple's, and she sensed a mind as calculating as her own, though less patient. He muttered something about a manuscript Osmond had promised, then turned away, dismissing the group. Miss Marple observed the interplay, her knitting needles idle in her bag, but her thoughts as precise as their rhythm. Clara's reticule, Osmond's guarded demeanour, Crane's restless energy. Each was a thread in a tapestry she could not yet see. She wandered from the tea stall, pausing at a display of jewelled daggers, their hilts glinting like stars. The vendor, a wiry man with a quick smile, extolled their craftsmanship, but Miss Marple's attention was on Osmond, who lingered nearby, his fingers brushing a leather-bound book, as if it held secrets beyond its pages. Beatrice, ever the hostess, steered them toward a quieter corner, where a carpet stall displayed weaves intricate as a novel's plot. Here, Clara seemed to relax, her fingers tracing the patterns, though her eyes remained distant. Miss Marple, pretending to admire a rug, asked gently, "Do you visit markets often, Miss Wentworth?" Clara started, her voice hesitant. "Not like this. London's shops are simpler." Her words trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the flush on her cheeks, so like the girls in Willowbrook who hid forbidden romances. As the afternoon waned, Beatrice announced they must return for the gala preparations. The villa was ablaze with light that evening, its chandeliers casting a golden glow over the gathered guests. Miss Marple, in her unassuming black dress, stood near a marble pillar, her eyes missing nothing. Clara, now in a sapphire gown, moved stiffly, her reticule replaced by a fan she wielded like a shield. Osmond Bay, resplendent in a tailored suit, conversed with a group of merchants, his laughter too loud. Professor Crane stood apart, nursing a glass of Reiki, his gaze fixed on a locked display case in the hall. Inside gleamed the jewelled dagger Miss Marple had seen in the bazaar, donated for the charity auction. Its blade caught the light, sharp and cold, and she wondered why Crane's eyes lingered on it. A new figure drew her attention. Julian Drake, a young art dealer whose charm was as polished as the villa's floors. His smile was dazzling, his conversation effortless, Yet Miss Marple sensed calculation beneath his ease. He approached Clara, whispering something that made her tense, her fan snapping shut. Miss Marple, unnoticed, watched their exchange, noting Julian's hand on Clara's arm, her quick withdrawal. It was a moment as telling as any village scandal, where a glance betrayed a heart's secrets. The gala unfolded with music and laughter, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She slipped into the library, where Beatrice kept her correspondence, and found a guest list. Julian's name was there, marked as a late edition, recommended by Clara. Osmond's name appeared too, alongside a note about his donation of a rare manuscript. Crane's entry mentioned his academic credentials, but nothing of his brusque manner. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the page, her thoughts circling back to the bazaar. The dagger, the manuscripts, the amulet Crane had mentioned in passing. Each was a clue, though their meaning eluded her. As the evening drew to a close, Beatrice joined her, radiant but weary. "Jane, are you enjoying yourself?" she asked. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. "It's a splendid affair, Beatrice. So many interesting people." Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, catching Osmond's hurried exit, Clara's pale face as she left the ballroom, and Crane's lingering glance at the dagger's case. The bazaar's enchantment had followed them here, weaving a web of motives and desires. Miss Marple, ever the observer, knew that beneath the gala's glitter lay shadows, and she was ready to step into their depths. Chapter 3. The Body in the Courtyard. The dawn broke over Istanbul with a serenity that belied the horror awaiting discovery. Miss Jane Marple, accustomed to the gentle rhythms of Willowbrook, awoke early in Lady Beatrice Harrow's villa, her sleep undisturbed by the city's distant hum. She sat by her window, her knitting untouched, her gaze tracing the Bosphorus's shimmering expanse. The house was quiet, save for the soft tread of servants preparing for the day. Yet, as Miss Marple sipped her tea, a piercing scream shattered the calm, echoing from the courtyard below. She rose swiftly, her movements precise despite her age, and descended the marble staircase. In the courtyard, a scene of chaos unfolded. Beatrice, her face ashen, stood frozen near a stone fountain, her hands clutching her shawl. Clara Wentworth, pale as a ghost, hovered at the edge, her eyes wide with terror. A small crowd of servants whispered in hushed Turkish, their glances darting toward a figure sprawled on the flagstones. It was Julian Drake, the charming art dealer from the gala, his elegant suit stained with a dark spreading pool of blood. A single wound marred his chest, and beside him lay the jeweled dagger from the display case, its blade dulled by crimson. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in the scene, her mind already sifting details as she might sort threads in her Willowbrook parlour. The courtyard was enclosed, its high walls draped with jasmine, accessible only through the villa's rear entrance or a heavy iron gate to the garden, which stood locked. The dagger, so prominent at the gala, had been forcibly removed from its case, the lock splintered. Yet, Miss Marple noted, no thief would abandon such a prize after committing murder. The act felt personal, not mercenary. Inspector Demire, a stocky man with a moustache as stern as his demeanour, arrived with a contingent of police. His dark eyes surveyed the scene with practised efficiency, and he barked orders in Turkish, cordoning off the courtyard. Beatrice, trembling, approached him, her voice unsteady. "Inspector, this is dreadful. Julian was a guest, a friend." She turned to Miss Marple, her eyes pleading. "Jane, you've unravelled tangles before. Please help us." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene but her mind racing, already drawing parallels to Willowbrook's quieter scandals. Inspector DeMere questioned the household with a brusqueness that contrasted Miss Marple's gentle probing. He noted the dagger's theft, suggesting a botched robbery, but Miss Marple's thoughts diverged. She knelt discreetly near the body, her gloves protecting her hands, and observed the wound's precision. A single, deliberate thrust. Julian's face, frozen in surprise, suggested he knew his attacker. She glanced at the villa's windows overlooking the courtyard, wondering who might have witnessed the act under cover of night. Clara Wentworth, summoned for questioning, stood rigid, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "I barely knew him," she stammered, though her eyes betrayed a deeper connection. Miss Marple recalled their tense exchange at the gala, Julian's hand on her arm, her swift retreat. Clara's denial rang hollow, much like the excuses of Willowbrook's young lovers caught in indiscretions. Osmond Bay, next to be questioned, was composed but tense, his fingers clenching as he spoke. "Julian and I had business, manuscripts, nothing more. He owed me money, but I wouldn't," his voice faltered. And Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, so unlike his polished demeanour in the bazaar. Professor Elias Crane, when called, was dismissive, his tone sharp. "A tragedy, but I hardly knew the man. That dagger? A gaudy trinket, not worth killing for." His scorn for the weapon piqued Miss Marple's interest. His expertise as an archaeologist suggested he knew more than he admitted. She recalled his fixation on the display case, his bulging pocket at dinner. What had he carried? Her mind turned to the amulet he'd mentioned, its rumoured curse a whisper in the bazaar's stalls. Beatrice, still shaken, invited Miss Marple to the drawing-room, where they sat with strong Turkish coffee. "Jane, I can't fathom it," she said, her hands trembling. "Julian was charming, perhaps too charming. He wanted me to invest in his art ventures, but I refused. Could that have—" She trailed off, her eyes searching Miss Marple's calm face. Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "People reveal themselves, Beatrice, in their actions. We shall see what they've hidden." A young maid, Ayla, brought fresh coffee, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the overlooked, engaged her gently. "You must see much working here," she said, her tone inviting confidence. Ayla hesitated, then whispered, "Last night I heard voices in the garden, angry ones. I couldn't see who, but one was Mr. Drake's." Miss Marple nodded, her mind conjuring Willowbrook's gossips, who spilled secrets over tea. Ayla's words were a thread, thin but vital, leading to the night's shadows. As the police continued their work, Miss Marple strolled the courtyard's perimeter, her eyes tracing the gate's lock, untouched and rusted, ruling out an outsider's entry. The villa's rear door, however, was unbolted, suggesting the killer moved freely within. She pictured the gala's guests, Clara's fear, Osmond's tension, Crane's detachment, and wondered whose secret had turned deadly. The dagger, she mused, was a distraction, its theft staged to mislead. The true motive lay elsewhere, perhaps in Julian's charm, which had ensnared more than hearts. Returning to the villa, Miss Marple passed the shattered display case, its glass glinting like broken promises. She paused, her fingers brushing the wood, her thoughts circling the amulet, The manuscripts, the whispered argument. In Willowbrook, motives were simple: love, greed, shame. But here, in Istanbul's enchanted web, they were layered with history and ambition. She felt the familiar stir of understanding, the pieces of the puzzle shifting into place, though the picture remained incomplete. As she rejoined Beatrice, her serene smile masked a mind as sharp as the dagger itself, ready to cut through the bazaar's secrets. Chapter 4. Whispers of Motive. The air in Lady Beatrice Harrow's villa hung heavy with the aftermath of murder, the morning's tragedy casting a pall over the opulent rooms. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows did little to warm the atmosphere, where suspicion clung like damp to the walls. Inspector DeMere, his notebook open, paced before the gathered guests, his questions sharp but methodical. Miss Marple, outwardly a quiet observer, watched each face with the keen perception honed in Willowbrook's village scandals, where a glance or a pause often spoke louder than words. Inspector DeMere began with Clara Wentworth, whose delicate frame seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. "Miss Wentworth," he said, his voice firm, "you claimed to barely know Mr. Drake, yet you recommended his presence at the gala. Explain." Clara's fingers twisted her handkerchief into knots, her eyes flickering toward the floor. "We met in London," she admitted, her voice trembling. "He was a friend, an acquaintance. He dealt in art, and I thought he'd be interested in the charity auction." Her words were halting, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up her neck, reminiscent of Willowbrook girls caught in half-truths about suitors. Clara's connection to Julian ran deeper than friendship, she was certain. Next, Osmond Bay faced the inspector's gaze, his polished demeanour strained. "Mr. Drake owed me money," he said, his hands clasped tightly. "A manuscript deal, rare Ottoman texts. He promised payment, but delayed, claiming the manuscripts were undervalued." His tone was controlled, but Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in his fingers, a sign of unease she'd seen in Willowbrook shopkeepers when debts went unpaid. Osmond's pride, she sensed, was wounded as much as his purse, and such wounds could fester into darker motives. Professor Elias Crane, when questioned, leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed with an air of impatience. "I had no business with Drake," he said curtly. "The dagger? A modern piece, overpriced and overhyped. I study relics, not trinkets." His dismissal was too quick, Miss Marple thought, recalling his fixation on the display case at the gala. His expertise suggested he could distinguish a replica from a treasure, yet he downplayed the dagger's significance. She wondered what else he might be minimizing, her mind circling back to the amulet he'd mentioned in the bazaar. Beatrice, questioned last, spoke with the candour of one unaccustomed to deceit. "Julian approached me about investing in his art ventures. Paintings, sculptures, some from dubious sources," she said, her brow furrowed. "I declined. He was persistent, but I saw no reason to risk my funds." Miss Marple noted the regret in her friend's voice, not for refusing Julian, but for the shadow his death cast over her home. Beatrice's honesty was a contrast to the guarded responses of the others, yet even she might hold pieces of the puzzle unwittingly. As the inspector retreated to confer with his men, Miss Marple sipped tea, her eyes drifting to the guests. Clara had retreated to a corner, her handkerchief now a crumpled rag. Osmond stared out a window, his jaw tight. Crane flipped through a book on Ottoman history, his feigned indifference unconvincing. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Willowbrook, where motives, love, greed, revenge were universal, dressed in different garb. Here, in Istanbul, they were cloaked in the bazaar's mystique, but no less human. She rose, her movements unhurried, and approached Ayla, the young maid who had spoken of voices in the garden. In the quiet of the pantry, where Ayla polished silver, Miss Marple's gentle tone drew her out. "You mentioned an argument, my dear," she said, her eyes kind but probing. "Anything else you recall?" Ayla hesitated, then whispered, "It was late, after the gala. I was clearing plates near the garden door. Mr. Drake was there, his voice sharp, but the other it was too low to know. They spoke of money, I think, and something about a find being dangerous." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing the word find beside Crane's amulet and Osmond's manuscripts. Ayla's words were a thread, fragile but vital, weaving through the mystery. Later, Miss Marple joined Beatrice in the library, where papers and guest lists lay scattered. "Jane, how do you stay so calm?" "Aksh," Beatrice asked, her hands fidgeting. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Observation, my dear, is a habit. People are much the same, whether in Willowbrook or Istanbul." She glanced at the guest list, noting Julian's name, added late, and Osmond's donation of a manuscript. Crane's entry mentioned a lecture on Ottoman relics, but nothing of his brusque manner. A pattern was forming, though its shape remained elusive. Stepping onto the balcony, Miss Marple surveyed the courtyard below, where police still lingered. The fountain's gentle splash masked the violence it had witnessed, but her eyes traced the path from the villa's rear door to Julian's body. The unbolted door suggested familiarity, an insider's access. She recalled Clara's tension with Julian, Osmond's unpaid debt, Crane's guarded interest in artifacts. Each had a reason to resent Julian, but which had turned resentment to murder? As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room, where the guests dined in strained silence. Clara pushed food around her plate, her eyes red-rimmed. Osmond murmured to a servant, his voice low. Crane, his book abandoned, stared at the empty display case, now cordoned by police tape. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts as precise as their clicks. The dagger was a prop, she suspected, its theft a ruse to obscure a deeper motive. Julian's charm had stirred envy or fear, perhaps both, and the truth lay in what he knew, or what he threatened to reveal. She recalled Willowbrook's intrigues, a jilted lover, a cheated merchant, a scholar's pride, and saw their echoes here. Clara's secrets, Osmond's pride, Crane's obsession with relics. Each was a spark that could ignite violence. As the candles flickered, casting shadows on the walls, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads together, sensing the killer's hand was closer than the police suspected. The bazaar's enchantment had woven a deadly spell, and she was determined to unravel it. Chapter 5. The Hidden Letter. The morning after Julian Drake's murder, the air in Lady Beatrice Harrow's villa carried a chill that no amount of Istanbul's golden sunlight could dispel. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the library where Beatrice kept her correspondence, sorted through a pile of letters with the quiet efficiency of one accustomed to finding order in chaos. Her knitting lay folded in her bag, a silent companion to her thoughts, which moved as deftly as her needles through the tangled motives of the household. The library, with its shelves of leather-bound books and view of the Bosphorus, was a haven of calm, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing. Not the faint tremor in Beatrice's hands as she joined her, nor the distant clatter of police in the courtyard below. Beatrice, her usual vivacity dimmed, sank into a chair. "Jane, this house feels cursed," she murmured, her gaze drifting to a portrait of her late husband. "First Julian, now all these questions." Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile, her voice gentle. "Houses are not cursed, my dear. Only people's actions, and actions leave traces." Her words, soft as they were, carried the weight of Willowbrook's quiet wisdom, where a misplaced word or glance often unravelled a village secret. As Beatrice sorted invitations for the cancelled gala, Miss Marple's attention fell on Clara Wentworth's velvet reticule, left carelessly on a side table. Its embroidered surface was slightly open, revealing a glimpse of crumpled paper within. With the discretion of one who had navigated many a Willowbrook parlour, Miss Marple eased the paper free while Beatrice was distracted by a servant's knock. The letter in Julian Drake's bold hand was brief but damning. "Clara, return the artifact or I'll expose you. You know the consequences." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind racing. An artifact? Could it be the jewelled dagger? Or something less obvious, like the amulet Professor Crane had mentioned in the bazaar? She slipped the letter back, her expression unchanged, but the discovery was a key turning in a lock. Determined to test her suspicions, Miss Marple proposed a walk through the Grand Bazaar, citing a need for air. Beatrice, eager to escape the villa's gloom, agreed, and Clara, though reluctant, joined them. The bazaar was as vibrant as ever, its stalls a kaleidoscope of silks and spices, but Miss Marple's focus was on Osman Bey's stall, tucked in a quieter alley. His display of manuscripts, their pages yellowed with age, drew scholars and collectors. But today his demeanour was tense, his smile forced. As Beatrice haggled over a brass lamp, Miss Marple lingered near Osman, her eyes catching a fleeting exchange. A cloaked figure slipped him a folded note, their face obscured before melting into the crowd. Osman's hand closed over the paper, his glance darting to ensure no one noticed. But Miss Marple had, and her mind filed the moment beside Clara's letter and Crane's amulet. At a nearby stall, a vendor spoke of a cursed Ottoman amulet, a relic rumoured to bring ruin to its possessor. Professor Crane was asking about it, the vendor confided, his voice low. Said it was lost, but he'd pay well to find it. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts circling. In Willowbrook, gossip about stolen goods or hidden debts often pointed to motive. And here, the amulet seemed a thread tying the guests together. Was it the artifact Julian had demanded from Clara? Had Osman acquired it, or Crane sought it? The bazaar's whispers were as telling as any village rumour. Back at the villa, Miss Marple observed the guests at luncheon, where tension simmered beneath polite conversation. Clara, pale and silent, barely touched her food, her eyes avoiding Osman, who spoke loudly of market trends. Crane, his usual brusqueness softened by wine, mentioned a recent dig near Istanbul, but his fingers drummed restlessly on the table. Miss Marple, her tea cooling, recalled the letter's threat. Julian's blackmail suggested he knew something dangerous. Perhaps Clara had stolen the amulet, or Osman had sold it illicitly, or Crane had lost it to Julian's schemes. Each possibility was a strand in the web she was weaving. Later, in the garden, Miss Marple found Ayla, the maid, tending roses. With her gentle probing, honed by years of coaxing secrets from Willowbrook's reticent, she drew out more. "That night," Ayla whispered, "I saw someone near the courtyard after the argument. A shadow, carrying something small, like a box or book." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. A box could hold an amulet, a book a manuscript. She thanked Ayla, her mind turning to Crane's bulging pocket at dinner, Osmond's secretive note, and Clara's desperate letter. As evening settled, Miss Marple sat alone in the library, her knitting resumed but her thoughts far from the grey scarf. The letter confirmed Julian's hold over Clara, but the amulet's shadow loomed larger. In Willowbrook, blackmail often stemmed from love or greed, but here, in Istanbul's ancient city, it was tangled with relics and ambition. Clara's theft, Osmond's dealings, Crane's obsession, each was a motive, but which had sparked murder? The courtyard's locked gate and unbolted door pointed to an insider, someone who moved freely in the villa. Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind as precise as their rhythm, piecing together the fragments of a truth hidden in the bazaar's enchanted depths. Chapter 6. A Dangerous Confrontation. The air in Lady Beatrice Harrow's villa grew taut as the day wore on, the shadow of Julian Drake's murder lengthening over the household like a storm cloud over Istanbul's minarets. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, observed the guests with the quiet intensity of a Willowbrook spinster passing village gossip. The clink of teacups and the murmur of strained conversation did little to mask the undercurrents of fear and suspicion. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind a serene smile, noted every gesture. Clara Wentworth's trembling hands, Osmond Bay's forced composure, Professor Elias Crane's restless glances toward the courtyard. The puzzle was taking shape, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through human facades, sensed the moment for action had come. Dinner that evening was a fraught affair. The dining-room's opulence, gilded mirrors and damask curtains, mocking the tension at the table. Beatrice, ever the gracious hostess, tried to steer conversation toward neutral ground, but her efforts faltered. Clara, her sapphire gown now replaced by a sombre grey dress, spoke little, her fork pushing lamb and pilaf in aimless circles. Osmond, seated opposite, launched into a tale of a rare manuscript he'd acquired, his voice too loud, his eyes avoiding Clara's. Miss Marple, sipping her sherbet, noted the edge in his tone, reminiscent of Willowbrook merchants masking debts with bravado. The spark came when Clara, her nerves frayed, interrupted Osmond. "You cheated him, didn't you?" she blurted, her voice sharp with accusation. "Julian said you sold him fakes, and he was furious." The room stilled, Fawkes pausing mid-air. Osmond's face darkened, his hand tightening on his glass. "Cheated? Drake was the swindler, Miss Wentworth, promising payment he never intended to deliver." His words were clipped, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in his eyes, a mirror to the anxious glances of Willowbrook's guilty. Beatrice, alarmed, tried to intervene, but the damage was done. Professor Crane, silent until now, set down his knife with a deliberate clink. "Enough of this," he said, his tone cutting. "I've a headache and no patience for squabbles." He rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor, and left the room, his coat pocket bulging as it had the previous night. Miss Marple's gaze followed him, her mind recalling Ayla's mention of a shadow carrying a small bundle. Was it a book, an amulet, or something else entirely? She excused herself soon after, citing fatigue, but her purpose was far from rest. In the quiet of the corridor, Miss Marple overheard a muffled sob from Clara's room. Pausing, she caught fragments of words. "Ruined everything. I didn't mean," spoken in a voice thick with despair. The echo of Willowbrook's heartbroken girls, weeping over lost loves or reputations, stirred her sympathy, but her resolve hardened. Clara's letter, Julian's blackmail, the amulet's shadow, these were pieces of a deadly mosaic, and Miss Marple was determined to see its pattern. Seeking answers, she sought out Ayla, finding the maid in the kitchen, polishing copper pots with nervous energy. "Ayla, my dear," Miss Marple began, her voice as soothing as a village confidante's. "You saw someone near the courtyard that night. Can you recall anything more?" Ayla's eyes darted to the door, then back. "It was Professor Crane," she whispered. "I didn't want to say before, but he was there, near the fountain, holding something wrapped in cloth. I thought it was his papers, but it was small, like a box." Miss Marple nodded, her mind slotting this beside Crane's bulging pocket and his dismissive words about the dagger. A box could hold an amulet, a relic worth killing for. Emboldened, Miss Marple sought Crane in the library, where he pored over a map of Ottoman dig sites. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp, casting his angular features in sharp relief. "Professor," she said, her tone mild but her eyes piercing, "you've spoken of an amulet, a rare Ottoman piece. Might it be connected to Mr. Drake's business?" Crane's head snapped up, his pen stilling. "You're meddling, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "The amulet is a scholar's interest, nothing more. I study history, not crimes." But his pallor and the twitch of his jaw betrayed him, much like Willowbrook's vicar when pressed about mislaid funds. Miss Marple pressed gently, her voice disarming. "Yet you were seen near the courtyard that night, carrying something. History can be dangerous, can't it?" Crane's eyes narrowed, but he forced a laugh. "You're mistaken. I was in my room, working." His denial was firm, but Miss Marple saw the crack in his composure, a fissure she'd widen in time. She withdrew with a polite nod, leaving him to his maps, but her mind was alight with connections, the amulet, the letter, the courtyard's locked gate. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by her window, the Bosphorus a dark ribbon below. Her knitting lay idle, her thoughts weaving the day's revelations. Clara's accusation, Osmond's defensiveness, Crane's secrecy, each pointed to a web of greed and fear, with Julian at its centre. The amulet, she suspected, was the true prize, its value or curse driving someone to murder. In Willowbrook, such motives were laid bare in tearful confessions, but here, in Istanbul's labyrinth, they hid behind smiles and shadows. Miss Marple's fingers itched for her needles, but her mind was her true tool, cutting through the bazaar's enchantments to the truth beneath. Chapter 7. The Truth Unravelled. The morning sun cast long shadows across Lady Beatrice Harrow's villa, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill of suspicion that lingered in the air. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting set aside, stood in the drawing-room, her slight figure commanding the attention of the assembled guests. Inspector Demire, his notebook poised, stood by the fireplace, his stern gaze softened by curiosity. Beatrice, Clara Wentworth, Osmond Bay, and Professor Elias Crane sat in a tense semicircle, their faces a study in unease. Miss Marple's serene demeanour, honed in the quiet parlours of Willowbrook, masked a mind that had woven the threads of murder into a coherent tapestry. The time had come to lay it bare. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice clear and unhurried, Julian Drake's death was no random act, nor was it about the jewel dagger, as some might have supposed. Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the room, noting Clara's pale cheeks, Osmond's clenched jaw, and Crane's rigid posture. It was about a secret, one that Julian wielded like a weapon. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, much as she would in Willowbrook when revealing a village scandal. She turned to Clara, her tone gentle but firm. "Miss Wentworth, you were entangled with Julian, weren't you?" Clara's eyes widened, her handkerchief twisting in her hands. Miss Marple drew the crumpled letter from her pocket, its ink stark against the crumpled paper. "This, found in your reticule, shows Julian demanding you return an artifact or face ruin. You stole something, didn't you?" Clara's sob broke the silence, her voice trembling. "It was an amulet, an Ottoman relic. I took it from Professor Crane's collection to settle a debt with Julian. He promised to sell it and clear my name, but he kept demanding more." The room stirred, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her authority quiet but undeniable. "You met Julian in the garden that night, pleading with him, as Ayla overheard. But you didn't kill him, did you?" Clara shook her head, tears streaming. "I begged him to stop, but he laughed. I left him there, alive." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Osmond. "Mr. Bay, you too had dealings with Julian over manuscripts. But there was more, wasn't there? The amulet Clara stole. It passed through Julian's hands to you." Osmond's face darkened, his fingers gripping his chair. "I bought it in good faith," he said, his voice strained. "Julian said it was his to sell. I planned to move it abroad, for a collector." His admission hung heavy, and Miss Marple's mind flashed to the cloaked figure in the bazaar, slipping him a note. Smuggling, she thought, was a dangerous game, much like the schemes of Willowbrook's less scrupulous traders. Her gaze settled on Crane, whose composure was fraying, his eyes darting to the door. "Professor Crane," she said, her voice soft but piercing, "you knew the amulet was stolen, didn't you? You overheard Clara and Julian in the garden, arguing about it. You followed Julian to the courtyard, intending to reclaim what was yours." Crane's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his silence as telling as a confession in Willowbrook's church hall. Miss Marple stepped forward, her narrative relentless. "The dagger was a convenience, taken from the display case in a moment of fury. You confronted Julian, and when he taunted you, perhaps revealing he'd sold the amulet to Osmond, you struck." Crane's face crumpled, his voice a hoarse whisper. "He mocked me, said the amulet was gone, that I'd never prove its worth. I didn't plan it. The dagger was there, and He trailed off, his head bowing, the weight of guilt as clear as any village sinner's. Inspector Demir stepped forward, his handcuffs glinting. "Professor Crane, you are under arrest." The room exhaled, tension breaking like a wave. Clara sobbed quietly. Osmond stared at the floor, and Beatrice clutched Miss Marple's arm, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Jane, how did you know?" she whispered. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People are much the same, Beatrice, whether in Willowbrook or Istanbul. They hide, but their secrets always show." As Crane was led away, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the amulet, still hidden in Osmond's stall, a relic that had sparked greed and death. She recalled Willowbrook's simpler dramas, a stolen heirloom, a betrayed trust. But here, in Istanbul's Enchanted Bazaar, the stakes were higher, the shadows deeper. Yet human nature, she knew, was the true constant, its frailties as clear under minarets as in Village Lane. Chapter 8. The Bazaar's Secrets. The late afternoon sun bathed Istanbul in a golden haze, its light glinting off the Bosphorus as Miss Jane Marple stood on the balcony of Lady Beatrice Harrow's villa. The air was warm, scented with jasmine from the garden below, but the tranquillity belied the storm of revelation that had just passed. Professor Elias Crane's confession, extracted with Miss Marple's quiet precision, had lifted the veil of suspicion from the household, yet the echoes of murder lingered. Her knitting lay untouched in her room, her mind too occupied with the final threads of the mystery to seek solace in its rhythm. Inspector Demir, efficient as ever, had overseen a swift search of Osman Bey's bazaar stall, guided by Miss Marple's deduction. Hidden beneath a stack of manuscripts, wrapped in a velvet cloth, was the Ottoman amulet, a small, intricately carved piece of jade, its surface etched with symbols that whispered of ancient curses. Osman, his composure shattered, admitted to acquiring it from Julian Drake, intending to sell it to a foreign collector. "I didn't know it would lead to this," he muttered, his voice hollow as he faced scrutiny for illicit trade. The inspector, though focused on Crane's arrest, noted Osman's confession, promising further investigation. Miss Marple, watching from the sidelines, saw in Osman's downfall the familiar greed of Willowbrook's less honest merchants, cloaked here in the bazaar's exotic allure. Clara Wentworth, her role in the theft exposed, sat in the drawing-room, her face pale, but her eyes clear of the terror that had haunted her. "I only wanted to be free of him," she confessed to Miss Marple, her voice soft. "Julian's threats, they trapped me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but firm, recalling the tearful girls of Willowbrook who had strayed and sought redemption. "You've owned your mistake, my dear," she said. "That's a start." Inspector Demir, moved by her remorse and the minor nature of her crime compared to murder, chose leniency, allowing Clara to remain free though chastened. Beatrice, her spirit reviving with the mystery's resolution, insisted Miss Marple extend her stay. "Jane, you've saved us," she said, her hands clasping her friend's. "One more week to see the city at peace." But Miss Marple shook her head, her smile gentle. "Willowbrook calls, Beatrice. My garden needs tending, and my neighbours their gossip." Her eyes twinkled, knowing the village's quiet dramas awaited her, less glamorous than Istanbul's, but no less human. As she packed her modest suitcase, Miss Marple reflected on the bazaar's enchantment, a labyrinth of beauty and betrayal, where relics held power enough to kill. The amulet, now in police custody, was a symbol of the greed that had ensnared Julian, Clara, Osman, and Crane. In Willowbrook, such motives, love, pride, avarice, played out in stolen glances or whispered debts. But here they were magnified by the city's ancient pulse. The jeweled dagger, a distraction from the true prize, had been Crane's desperate choice, its theft a clumsy mask for his rage. At the station, the Orient Express awaited, its polished cars a promise of return to simpler shores. Miss Marple boarded, her eyes lingering on Istanbul's skyline, where minarets pierced the dusk. In her compartment, she opened her knitting bag, her needles resuming their familiar click. Clara, seeing her off, had offered a shy thank you, and Osman, subdued, had nodded farewell. Beatrice's embrace had been warm, her promise to write sincere. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts were already turning homeward, to Willowbrook's lanes, where human nature, stripped of the bazaar's dazzle, was her true study. As the train pulled away, she mused on the case, the letter, the amulet, the courtyard's shadows. Each had been a clue, pieced together with the patience of her knitting. Istanbul, with its vibrant chaos, had tested her, but its secrets were no match for her quiet observation. The bazaar's spell, like Willowbrook's gossip, hid truths that only a clear eye could see. Smiling faintly, Miss Marple settled back, her needles weaving as steadily as her mind, ready for whatever puzzle awaited in the village she called home.